Every fall, in quiet neighborhoods across America, a strange little tragedy plays out behind fences and garages. A homeowner steps into the yard with a pruning saw, points at a wild shrub glowing red at the edge of the property, and decides it has to go. Not because it is dead, not because it is useless, but because somebody once told them the name was dangerous. The plant they are cutting down is staghornsumac. It rises in loose colonies along roadsides, old fields, sunny slopes, and forgotten corners of backyards. In late summer, it lifts tight crimson fruit clusters into the air like little torches. Touch the branch and you feel soft velvet, the same texture as a young deer's antler. Wait until autumn, and the whole shrub catches fire in shades of scarlet, orange, and deep red. But the real surprise is hidden in those cones. Break them apart in cool water, and the water turns pink. Taste it, and the flavor lands sharp and clean, like wild lemonade with a dry berry edge. Dry the fruit and crush it, and you get a tart red seasoning close to the sumac, sprinkled over hummus, flatbread, grilled meat, and roasted vegetables across the Middle East. That is the part most people never learn. The shrub Americans often fear in their yards is related to one of the world's oldest sour spices. It feeds birds, colors the fall landscape, and can make a free drink from nothing more than water, patience, and a dry day. So why do so many people see those red cones and reach for a saw? Because one word got attached to the wrong fear: sumac. The confusion begins with a perfectly reasonable fear aimed at the wrong target. Poison sumac is not a myth. It is a real plant, and it deserves respect. Like poison ivy and poison oak, it carries urushiol, the oily compound that can leave skin blistered, swollen, and painfully itchy. For anyone who has ever had that rash, the warning is easy to understand. When people hear the word sumac, their mind jumps straight to danger. But that leap is where the mistake happens. Staghorn sumac and poison sumac are not the same plant. One belongs to the genus Rus, the other belongs to toxicodendron, the same troublesome group as poison ivy. They are relatives only in the broad extended family sense, because both sit inside the cashew family, Anacardiaceae. And that family is much larger and stranger than most people realize. It contains mangoes, it contains pistachios, it contains cashews too. It also contains plants that can irritate skin badly. Nature does not organize itself according to our fears. So the old backyard logic sounds simple. Poison sumac is bad. Staghorn sumac has sumac in the name. Therefore, staghorn sumac must be bad too. But by that logic, a mango should be guilty because poison ivy exists. A cashew should be thrown away because it has an unpleasant cousin. That is how a useful plant became a suspect. Not through evidence, but through association. The name carried the fear. The fear became a habit, and the habit was passed down until people stopped asking what plant they were actually looking at. The good news is that this mistake is easy to fix. You do not need to be a botanist. You do not need a field guide the size of a dictionary. In most cases, you only need to look at three things: the berries, the branches, and the ground under your feet. Staghorn sumac holds its fruit upright. The clusters are dense, fuzzy, and red, often shaped like narrow cones or little flames. They do not dangle. They do not hide. They stand at the tips of the branches as if the plant is trying to announce itself from across the road. Then look at the twigs. Young staghorn sumac branches are covered in soft hairs. Run a careful finger across one, and you understand the name instantly. That velvety surface reminded people of a young stag's antler, still soft before it hardens. Now look around the plant. Staghorn sumac loves open light. It shows up on dry banks, highway edges, field borders, old pastures, power line cuts, and sunny places where other shrubs struggle. It is a plant of exposed ground and hard weather. Poison sumac tells a completely different story. Its fruit is not red. It is pale, usually white to grayish, and the berries hang downward in loose clusters. Its stems are smooth instead of fuzzy. And most importantly, poison sumac is a wetland plant. It wants swamps, bogs, marshes, seepage areas, and places where your boots sink into the ground. That difference matters. If you are standing beside a dry roadside in full sun, looking at fuzzy red cones pointing upward, you are not looking at poison sumac. You are almost certainly looking at one of the harmless red-fruited sumacs. The rule is simple enough to remember for life. Red cones standing up on dry ground, useful plant. White berries hanging down in wet ground, do not touch. That one sentence could have saved thousands of shrubs from being cut to the ground. Before grocery stores, before bottled lemonade, and long before backyard myths turned this shrub into a villain, staghorn sumac had a place in everyday life. Native communities across North America knew it not as a threat, but as a useful seasonal plant. The red fruit clusters were gathered when they were dry and tart, then soaked in cool water to make a pink drink that early English speakers would later call Indian lemonade. It was not a fancy recipe. It was practical, fast, and perfectly suited to hot weather. Wild fruit, cold water, a little thyme, and something sweet if you had it. The flavor comes from the fine acidic coating on the outside of the tiny fruits. That is why rain matters so much. A heavy storm can rinse away the sharpness, leaving the cones dull and weak. But on a dry late summer day, a good cluster can taste bright enough to surprise you. Staghorn sumac was also remembered for more than flavor. Indigenous uses varied by nation and region, but sumac appears again and again in ethnobotanical records as a plant connected with drinks, washes, and simple remedies for the mouth and throat. That does not mean it was magic. It means people watched closely, tested carefully, and kept what worked. There is real chemistry behind the experience. The fruits contain organic acids, including malic acid and ascorbic acid, better known as vitamin C. Those compounds help explain the sour, refreshing bite. In a world where fresh fruit was seasonal and winter could be long, tart wild plants mattered. They were not just snacks. They were part of survival knowledge. And maybe that is the most important difference between the old way of seeing this plant and the modern one. Earlier generations asked, "What can this do for us?" Many people today ask only, "Could this hurt me?" Fear made the plant smaller. Knowledge made it useful. Now comes the irony that should bother us a little. While modern Americans were learning to distrust staghorn sumac, European gardeners once treated it as something worth showing off. To them, it was not a weed at the edge of a parking lot. It was a strange and beautiful North American shrub, imported across the Atlantic for gardens that were built to impress. Imagine that for a moment. A plant now dismissed as suspicious brush once stood in the cultivated landscapes of people who collected rare species the way others collected silver, paintings, or fine furniture. It had everything a garden designer wanted: bold shape, tropical-looking leaves, upright crimson fruit, and a fall color so intense it could stop a visitor in the path. English horticulture was already cataloging the pleasures of the garden in the early 1600s, and North American plants were becoming objects of curiosity and status. By the time staghorn sumac settled into European collections, its wild American character had become part of its value. It looked exotic because it was. Then, in the 1750s, Carl Linnaeus gave the plant the formal Latin name Rus tifina, fixing it inside the new scientific order that would shape modern botany. The name pointed back to its most memorable feature: the hairy young branches, like antlers in velvet. So the shrub being hacked away behind a garage today was once admired across an ocean. Not feared, not sprayed, not dragged to the curb. admired. That is how strange plant memory can be. The same species can be treasure in one century, nuisance in another, and food again the moment somebody remembers what it is. And this is where the story moves from the roadside to the kitchen. Because if you have ever eaten Middle Eastern food, there is a good chance you have already tasted sumac. Maybe it was dusted over hummus in a deep red ring. Maybe it was folded into za'atar with herbs and sesame seeds. Maybe it brightened grilled lamb, chicken, onions, rice, roasted potatoes, or a simple salad with a lemony bite that did not quite taste like lemon. That flavor often comes from Rus coriaria, a Mediterranean cousin of staghorn sumac. It is the sumac most commonly dried, ground, packed into jars, and sold as a spice around the world. But the wild American sumac at the edge of the field carries a similar family signature. Tart, fruity, red, and sharp enough to wake up heavy food. That is the comedy of the whole thing. People will drive to a specialty market and pay for a little jar of imported sumac, then come home and cut down a shrub offering a cousin of that same sour brightness for free. Of course, not every wild cone is perfect. Good flavor depends on timing, weather, and clean gathering. You want the red clusters when they are dry, vivid, and tangy, not faded, moldy, or washed out by rain. But when they are right, they can become a seasoning that feels both ancient and local. There is another reason cooks have valued sumac for so long. It is not just colorful. It is rich in plant compounds, especially polyphenols, the same broad category of compounds that gives many deeply colored fruits, teas, and spices their antioxidant power. That does not turn sumac into a miracle cure, and it should not be sold as one. But it does help explain why so many food traditions kept reaching for it. A pinch of sumac does something simple and powerful. It makes food taste alive. For a long time, sumac did not need to be rediscovered, because nobody had forgotten it yet. It was simply one of those ordinary plants that made itself useful in quiet ways. Its leaves, bark, and fruit carried tannins, the same bitter plant compounds that can bind proteins and help turn animal hides into leather. In older rural economies, that mattered. A shrub on the edge of a field was not just scenery. It could become part of a tannery, a dye pot, or a homemade ink. Its color had value, too. Sumac could help produce dark inks and earthy dyes, the kind of practical materials people once made before everything arrived in bottles, cans, and plastic tubs. The plant stood at the meeting point between food, craft, medicine, and landscape. And it was never useful only to humans. Leave those red cones standing into winter, and the yard changes. When snow covers the grass and insects disappear, birds come back to the dried fruit. Not because sumac is the sweetest food in the world, but because it is still there when many other foods are gone. In hard weather, still there can mean survival. That is one reason cutting it down thoughtlessly feels like such a loss. A stand of staghorn sumac can hold a roadside bank in place, shelter small wildlife, feed winter birds, and turn a poor patch of dry ground into a blaze of autumn color. Yet ordinary usefulness is easy to overlook. People remember the dangerous cousin. They remember the scary name. They remember the warning, but not the plant itself. And that may be how knowledge disappears. Not all at once, but one practical detail at a time. Now return to the homeowner in the yard. The saw is in their hand. The red cones are glowing above the fence. For years, they believed this shrub was a danger, a weed, a problem with a poisonous name. But now the scene looks different. Those cones are not a warning sign. They are a recipe. To make sumac lemonade, wait until late summer or early fall, when the clusters are deep red and tart. Choose a clean place, away from traffic, sprayed lawns, or polluted ditches. Pick on a dry day, because rain can wash away the acidic coating that gives the drink its flavor. Snap off a few good clusters, break them into a jar, Cover them with cool water, never boiling water. Heat pulls bitter tannins from the stems and fruit, turning bright wild lemonade rough and mouth-drying. Cold water keeps the flavor clean. Let it sit for 15 to 30 minutes. Stir it, crush the clusters lightly, and watch the water turn rose pink. Then strain it through cloth, a coffee filter, or a fine sieve so the tiny hairs and bits of fruit stay behind. Sweeten it with honey, sugar, or nothing. The result is not a novelty. It is an old American flavor returning to the glass. And if you dry the clusters, rub the red fruit from the stems, and grind it into a coarse powder, you have a local version of a spice people still buy in little jars. Sprinkle it over roasted vegetables, grilled meat, rice, eggs, or flatbread. It brings color, sourness, and memory back to the table. Just remember to take modestly. Leave plenty for winter birds, and never harvest anything you cannot identify. So the next time autumn lights up the roadside and you see those red torches standing above dry ground, pause before you call them weeds. You may be looking at lemonade. You may be looking at spice. You may be looking at knowledge that was never lost by the plant, only by us. Subscribe to Botanical Vault and stay close. The next forgotten plant is waiting.